Have you ever noticed that the person who remains calm in the face of conflict always seems to come out on top? The secret to winning any debate without saying anything is not to have the best words. It all comes down to knowing when to be silent. When you quit over-elaborating, you gain control, even while the other person rants and repeats themselves to make a point. It's similar to an oxygen-fueled wildfire in that it grows larger the more air you give it, but it extinguishes itself when you take it away. Or think of a chess master who allows his opponent to overextend, makes blunders, and then strikes with precision without hurrying or reacting emotionally. That's the power of strategic silence. You may choose to rise above their disarray or join in on their arguments while they are losing themselves in their feelings. The balance changes when you gain control because they start to question themselves the moment you stop reacting and maintain your position. Without speaking louder or demonstrating anything, you've already won, and their confidence falters and their words seem hollow. How is it done? While they lose control, remain composed. Let's begin by talking about one of the most underestimated yet successful tactics for winning a dispute: maintaining composure while the other party becomes uncontrollable. The majority of individuals think that the strongest arguments, the most supporting data, or the loudest voice will prevail in a dispute. But what matters most is how you act when feelings take precedence over logic. Fades, and someone has already weakened their own argument the instant they start arguing from emotion instead of reason. Here's when your ability to maintain composure works to your advantage because it makes them look insane. In actuality, people who debate emotionally expose their own flaws. You're in charge, observing, evaluating, and waiting for the ideal opportunity to react, while they are busy reacting. By maintaining your composure, you change the balance of power and make them handle their own feelings while you stay unfazed. Stoic wisdom is useful in this situation. They seem less credible and more desperate the louder they get. They also seem more frustrated. While you have no control over other people's reactions, they may raise their voices, misrepresent your comments, or try to provoke you. You do have control over your own. According to Marcus Aurelius, you have power over your mind, not outside events. When you acknowledge this, you will discover strength. You can either remain composed while they lose it or remain composed while they let their emotions dictate how they behave. In any event, you gain the respect of everyone around you in addition to the argument. Allow me to introduce you to a fellow I know. Let's call him James. Once got into a heated fight with a vengeful coworker who kept interrupting him in an attempt to gain an answer. James didn't smirk, roll his eyes, or jump to his defense. He just listened. Everyone in the room supported James when he eventually spoke because his comments were cool, collected, and reasonable. This was not because he had stronger arguments, though he did, but rather because he maintained his composure while the other person seemed to be going crazy. How can you become proficient at pausing before acting when you're upset or frustrated? Climbing allow them to become emotional and display their vulnerability while they lose control because the person who maintains composure always has the actual strength, the steadiest intellect, not the loudest voice, wins arguments. Second, when someone yells, speak in a softer tone since it makes them seem even more uncontrollable. The more they lose control, the more silly they seem. So watch their vitality wane as they lose it. Recall the second untouchable. One of the finest ways to win a discussion without really getting into a fight is to ask intelligent questions instead of defending yourself. Let's talk about this. The problem is that when most people are attacked in a debate, they immediately go into defensive mode and try to defend and justify their stance. Since you're answering their complaints rather than disputing their position, you've already lost control of the conversation the moment you start defending. Rather than arguing, here is the truth. Asking a question that forces someone to consider more thoroughly can help you flip a weak argument around rather than confronting it head-on. The best part is that you don't even need to say much, just allow their own words work against them. The more they strain to defend themselves, the more their argument breaks down. Stoic wisdom is useful in this situation. Marcus Aurelius asserts that a man's strength increases with his level of mental calmness. A calm strategic mind will always do better than an emotional defensive one, rather than getting caught up in a back-and-forth circle and putting the burden of evidence on them. It is your responsibility to assist them in seeing their own contradictions, not to argue with them. Their argument will not hold up under strain if it is weak, and it will break under its own weight if it is flawed. Let's name the man I'll tell you about. Daniel didn't become defensive when a colleague said that his project proposal was unrealistic. Instead, he inquired, "What specifically makes you think it won't work?" Daniel remarked, "How would that be different from how we handled similar challenges in the past?" When the colleague paused and brought up a small matter. The colleague stumbled, understanding that he was merely opposing for the purpose of opposing, not because he had a compelling case. He was retracing his steps in a matter of minutes, and Daniel had won the fight without ever yelling. Last but not least, resist the urge to defend yourself and insist that the person asking the questions fully explain their position, which is often weaker than they think. After all, the person asking the questions ultimately controls the conversation. Allow them to struggle, speak, and let their own words be used against them. Making the other person aware of their own shortcomings, rather than shouting the loudest, is how arguments are won. The third, let's talk about one of the most underestimated yet powerful tactics in a debate, making them question themselves by remaining silent. Sometimes the most effective answer is none at all, when used appropriately. The majority of people think that talking more, demonstrating more, and responding to every argument is the key to winning a debate. Silence is not a sign of weakness, rather, it is a psychological technique that forces the other person to change their position. Titus, the epic, famously remarked, "Let silence be your goal." When someone is debating, they anticipate opposition and want you to respond with similar vigor. However, if you just sit back, remain composed, and say nothing, you give them nothing to fight against, which is when doubt begins to seep into their thoughts. They begin to question, "Did I say something incorrectly? Do they have knowledge that I do not? I only undermine my own claim that uncertainty exists." Unless speaking is more valuable, that's the key. Not every point requires a response, and not every attack calls for a heated discussion. Sometimes the wisest course of action is to be silent because it not only avoids conflict but also compels the other person to face their own thoughts, issues, and anxieties. A man I know will be introduced to you. Let's call him Alex. Was engaged in a heated argument with a colleague who was making a valiant effort to disprove him. While the co-worker persisted in arguing, interrupting, presenting counterarguments, and attempting to elicit a response, Alex only listened. The co-worker then began repeating himself, filling in the blanks, and attempting to support his own claims as though he needed Alex's approval. This was a fascinating turn of events. It became more and more clear as he spoke that he was not as sure as he said he was, and by the time Alex replied, his colleague had already refuted his own assertion. As much as you allow them to, they will try to fill the gap, often exposing their own weaknesses in the process. Silence is ultimately power. It makes them uncomfortable, makes them question themselves, and most importantly, it gives you authority without ever saying a word. Should you discover this useful struck like that, they might become much more uncertain and ultimately break beneath their own remarks. Additionally, sign up for more insightful posts. The fourth strategy is to accept the situation and then shift the conversation. Let's discuss a tactic that annihilates your opponent. Most individuals believe that disputing whatever the other person says is the best way to win an argument. The issue is that this gives the impression that you are defensive rather than logical. Actually, they are surprised and start to expect resistance when you agree with some of their views. Even when they want you to push back, saying something like, "You know what, that's a fair point," or "I understand where you're coming from," totally changes the tone of the debate. Since you can now steer the conversation in your direction and they are far more likely to listen because you didn't flatly reject everything, you are in control rather than arguing. In this case, Stoic wisdom is helpful. According to Marcus Aurelius, be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. This suggests that while you should be solid with your own discipline and reasoning, you should also be receptive to other points of view and accommodating in discussions. You don't have to prove yourself right at all costs or fight merely for the sake of fighting. Instead of fearing agreement, a truly powerful person uses it as a tool to guide the conversation. I'll give you a call and tell you about a woman I know. Sarah was not entirely in agreement with a colleague's notion when they were discussing a project approach. Instead of dismissing the idea right away, she said, "You make a great point about efficiency and I totally agree that we need to streamline the process." After that one remark, the co-worker felt heard, but Sarah skillfully shifted the conversation. However, I believe that if we do that, we might lose some quality. What would happen if we integrated the best features of both ideas? In the end, the co-worker agreed with her. How can this strategy be used effectively? Ultimately, accepting the truth does not imply surrender. Rather, it entails taking the initiative to guide the discussion. Find common ground first. Even the most vehement arguments have legitimate points made by the other side. Second, say yes out loud. When you affirm their viewpoint, they become less defensive. Lastly, keep them interested rather than alienate them by guiding the discussion in your direction. By presenting yourself as someone who is worth listening to rather than as an enemy, you can win the argument without making it seem like the Fifth War. Allowing the other person to argue themselves into a corner is one of the most ingenious ways to win a disagreement. Most people feel obliged to correct mistakes and disprove every point, but this is the truth. They will overstate, exaggerate, and point out their own errors if you let them talk any longer. They find more paradoxes the more they talk. Here's the truth without asking you to do anything. Overly eager to establish their point, people start making claims without giving them any thought. The more they communicate, the harder it is for them to stay consistent.